Throughout the story, Luffy has asked many people to join his crew, and although some accepted, a lot of them refused for various reasons. But did you ever wonder what would have happened if everyone Luffy asked actually decided to join? How many members would the crew have, and most importantly, how strong would they be with all the new members? Well, for starters, back when Luffy was just a little kid, he already asked two very powerful characters to join his crew. Yeah, I'm talking about Ace and Sabo. Now, it's hard to imagine them accepting Luffy's invitation considering he is the youngest of the three, but for the sake of this video, let's say that both of them agreed to become Luffy's subordinates and join his future pirate crew. All of them would then spend the next few years in Fuchsia Village training real hard in order to prepare for the adventures ahead. Also, instead of Ace and Sabo trying to leave the kingdom early, they would agree to wait until Luffy is ready. Before they even knew it, 10 years would pass and Luffy would grow up to be a much stronger version of himself because he had some excellent training partners. Combining their money, the three of them would be able to buy a much better ship compared to the small boat Luffy used to begin his journey. And on Luffy's 17th birthday, they would officially set sail. They would be mostly fine up until they encounter the giant whirlpool. Since none of them really know how to navigate, they would most likely adopt the same dumb strategy as Luffy did in the main story, which is hiding in a barrel and hoping for the best. So instead of finding one barrel, the Alvida pirates would wind up finding 3 barrels and bringing them onto their ship. The 3 brothers would then jump out of the barrels and absolutely destroy Alvida and her crew, leaving Kobe in shock. The 3 of them, along with Kobe, would then arrive at Shell's Town. Here they would split up in order to carry out their own goals. Luffy would focus on helping Kobe get enlisted into the Marines, Ace would look for information on their next destination, while Sabo would work on buying supplies. While trying to help Kobe, Luffy would soon meet Zoro, and same as in the original story, he would decide to free him and invite him into his crew. Ace and Sabo wouldn't be too happy about Luffy recruiting random people he just met, but they would know there's no point in trying to change his mind. So with Kobe left behind, all 4 of the Straw Hats would head for Orange Town. Since Ace asked around, he'd be aware of Buggy's presence on the island even before they arrive. From here on, this arc would go pretty much the same, with the crew easily defeating Buggy and recruiting Nami. Now, before the crew continues to Syrup Village, there's one more place the crew needs to visit first, the Island of Rare Animals. Now, you may be wondering, why are we even covering this island? It's basically only one episode where nothing interesting happens. And although that's true, the important thing here is that Luffy actually asked Gaimon to join his crew. So yeah, I guess the Straw Hats now have a weird new member. All of them would soon arrive at Syrup Village, where they'll meet Usopp. Things would more or less play out the same here as well, with the crew helping Usopp and defeating Kuro. Once again, Ace and Sabo won't be too happy that Luffy asked a pathological liar to join their crew, but they would go along with it. Luffy is the boss after all. Finally getting a proper ship, the crew would continue their journey towards Barati. With so many people on board this time around, the crew would soon run out of food, which would make Luffy realize that he needs to recruit a cook as soon as possible. However, their new cook might not be who you think. You see, in the original story, before asking Sanji to join the crew, Luffy actually asked Zeph first. Although Zeph originally refused the invitation, this time around, Luffy would give his all in order to convince him. Eventually, the Krieg pirates would attack Barati, but with Ace and Sabo on board, they would get destroyed well before Mihawk even arrives. During this battle, Zeph would feel nostalgic for his own pirating days and would rethink Luffy's offer to join the crew. Mihawk would soon arrive on Barati, confused to see that the Krieg pirates had already been dealt with. This is when Zoro would jump in to directly challenge Mihawk. Although he would quickly lose, his resolve would amaze Zeph, who would officially accept Luffy's invitation to join the Straw Hats. And even though Luffy now has a new cook on board, it's still likely that he would invite Sanji as well so he could achieve his dream of finding the All Blue. With 2 of the best chefs in the East Blue on board, the crew would then head straight for Arlong Park. The first thing they do on land is witness the horrors inflicted upon the village by the fishmen. Since Zeph visited the Grand Line before, he would tell Luffy a bit of the fishmen history and how they actually have their own island on the Grand Line. Anyways, with so many strong fighters on board this time around, the crew would waste no time and would instantly invade Arlong Park. While Ace, Sabo, Zoro, and Sanji deal with the fishmen, Luffy would attack Arlong. And after a short battle, the Straw Hats would be victorious. Nami would then break down in tears and would agree to officially become the crew's navigator. After finishing up things in Arlong Park, the crew would head for Logetown. While on their way, all of the new crewmates would slowly start to get to know each other and would share some stories. Nothing especially interesting would happen during this arc. The crew would do some shopping up until Smoker starts chasing them around. Although the crew is far stronger now, they still don't know any hockey, so running from Smoker would be their only option. Dragon would soon appear to assist them, and using his wind powers, he would help them escape towards the reverse mountain. Since Zeph already knows how to scale the mountain, he'd take command of the ship and guide them through it. Reaching the other side, the crew would be greeted by a giant whale blocking their way. Same as in the original, they'd get eaten, and then they'd meet Crocus inside. From here, things would basically go the same way they did in the main story, up until the point Luffy tries to comfort Laboon. Since he loves animals, Gaimon would express his disapproval of Luffy's actions the whole time, till he sees Laboon tear up and accept the Straw Hat's promise. Meanwhile, I can see Sabo and Ace messing with Vivi and Mr. Nine and absolutely terrifying them. Acknowledging the strength of Luffy's crewmates, Vivi would come clean immediately, explaining the Alabasta situation and asking for their help. While Ace and Sabo carefully consider her request, Luffy would simply agree to help her, which would infuriate his brothers. Anyways, before the crew departs, Luffy would do another questionable thing. He would ask Crocus to join his crew. In the main story, Crocus obviously refused this request, but in this version, he'll have to accept, meaning that the crew would get a new doctor. Also, Crocus would probably sense a similar energy to Roger's coming from Luffy and would want to help the boy achieve his dream of becoming the Pirate King. Now, with a ship filled to the brim with all sorts of characters, the Straw Hats would quickly make their way to Whiskey Peak. On the way, Zoro would bond with some of the older members of the crew like Zeph and Crocus, and they would enjoy drinking together. Meanwhile, Saba would try to talk to Vivi and would start bonding with her, sensing that she's a good person who's concerned for her people's safety. Before they reach the shore, Vivi would inform the crew that the island is full of bounty hunters who would try to kill them. This would pique Zoro and Ace's interest, and they'll compete to see which one of them can defeat more of them. Sanji would obviously join the fun too. After making short work of all the bounty hunters on the island, Vivi and Igaram would meet up in order to discuss what they intend to do next. Soon, the crew would arrive on Little Garden. Sensing that it's an abandoned island, Gaimon would be the first person to jump off in order to experience the local wildlife. Saba would volunteer to run after him in order to keep him safe, while Crocus would prefer to lay back and lounge on the lawn chair he brought along with him. While everyone else goes onto the island to gather supplies, Ace would stay behind in order to talk to Crocus about his father, as he would be interested in knowing more about him. Most of Little Garden would go exactly the same as the main story. The only thing that would change is that the crew would defeat their enemies much easier this time around with Sabo and Zeph's help. Back on the ship, the crew would continue their journey to Alabasta, and Nami would fall sick. Now, despite having a doctor on board already, I don't really think Crocus would be able to cure her. You see, Crocus was only a doctor for around 3 years on Roger's ship, so he isn't that experienced. And considering that Nami's disease was very rare, it's unlikely he would know how to cure it. So the crew would need to go to the Drum Island all the same. After blasting through Wapol's forces, Luffy, Sanji, Usopp, and Nami would head straight for the abandoned castle. Meanwhile, Ace, Sabo, and Vivi would take a ride to the top of the mountain on Dalton's sled. Zoro and Gaimon would stick together in order to explore the island and would inevitably get lost. Once Luffy and Nami arrive at the castle, things would go mostly the same as in the main story, with Wapol making his return. Zoro would then greet Wapol and his soldiers outside the castle and prepare to slice them down with Chopper's help. So at this point in the main story, Chopper left Dr. Kureha in order to join Luffy's crew. However, this time, he wouldn't have to do that because Kureha would come on board with him. In case you don't remember, Luffy actually asked her to join way before he asked Chopper. So I guess Straw Hats would now have a total of 3 doctors on the ship. Setting sail with 2 new crew members, the Straw Hats would quickly realize that Going Merry is way too small for all these people and would start thinking about switching ships. On their way to Alabasta, Kureha would probably tease Crocus about being a bad doctor, as he couldn't even help Nami, but the two would eventually become good friends and would talk about medicine together. Anyways, the crew would soon arrive on Alabasta Shore, where all crew members would split up to do their own thing. Slowly, each crewmate would realize on their own how Crocodile's actions impacted the citizens of Alabasta and would all agree that he needs to be stopped as soon as possible. Considering that this time around the crew has some senior members, I believe that they wouldn't fall for that dumb trap Crocodile set up for them in the original story. However, they still can't defeat Crocodile without Haki, right? Well, that's not really true. You see, I believe that before they engage in a fight with Crocodile, Crocus would tell Luffy about his Sand Devil fruit and how it works. He would then tell him that they could probably counter his powers with some kind of liquid, most likely water. Remember, Crocus was on Pirate King's ship, so he must have encountered a lot of Logia users and would know exactly how their powers work. Anyways, now equipped with water, the entire crew would absolutely overwhelm Crocodile. Inevitably, Luffy would send Crocodile flying and recruit Robin soon after that. Eventually, all of the Straw Hats would be invited to rest up and party at the royal castle. After the celebration, Vivi would surprise the crew with a new, larger ship, since the Going Merry was getting too small for all of them. Usopp wouldn't be too happy about this, but Cobra would reassure him that he would take extra good care of their old ship. However, gifting the Straw Hats a ship isn't the only thing Vivi would do, because soon after, she would announce that she would be joining Luffy's crew. So with a new ship and another member on board, the Straw Hats would set sail towards Jaya. There, they'd briefly run into Blackbeard's crew, but nothing would come of it. Then they'd visit Mont Blanc Cricket's residence. Hearing about how dangerous the knock-up stream is, Crocus would inform Luffy that there's no need to take any risks, since he knows of an alternative method to get to Skypiea that lies somewhere in the New World. However, Luffy being Luffy, he would completely ignore his warnings and decide to go with his original plan. Once there, some Skypians might even recognize Crocus, since he was once there already with the Roger Pirates. This would help the crew gain their trust much faster and make their overall adventure on Skypiea much easier. Same as in the original, Luffy would be the one to defeat Enel while the rest of the crewmates would run for their lives. After ending the 400-year-old Sky Wars, the Straw Hats would ride a balloon back down to the Blue Sea. Even though they changed ships recently, using the knock-up stream would almost completely destroy their new ship too, so they would have to look for a replacement soon. With all of that commotion behind them, the crew's next destination is Water 7. On the way there, the Straw Hats would meet Granny Kokoro and Chimney, and I can easily see Kokoro taking an interest in Crocus, which would make him really uncomfortable. Anyways, setting foot on the island, the crew would split up yet again, with Luffy, Ace, Sabo, Nami, and Zeph heading for the dockyard and the rest going out to shop instead. In this version of the story, they wouldn't wind up losing all of their money, as Frankie's family wouldn't succeed in stealing it. After commissioning the Galila workers to build them a new ship, the Straw Hats would spend a few days waiting for the construction to finish. While they are waiting, Robin would still vanish and work behind the scenes with CP9, same as she did in the original. Unfortunately for the Straw Hats, work on the ship would suddenly stop once the news spreads about Iceberg's failed assassination. With half the crew staying back at the hotel, the other half would infiltrate Iceberg's residence, only to find CP9 there. Even though Luffy would have Ace and Sabo on his side for this fight, the Straw Hats would still lose to Lucci and Blue Nose Rokushiki techniques. The important thing to remember here is that neither Ace nor Sabo have their Devil Fruit abilities this time around, so they unfortunately wouldn't be able to make any difference in this fight. After protecting Iceberg and saving him from a burning building, the Straw Hats would regroup in order to prepare and bring Robin back. Meanwhile, Iceberg would take the time to fix up Rocket Man. The Frankie family would suddenly show up at the secret station and beg the Straw Hats to take them along in order to save their leader. Things would inevitably lead up to the events of Ennius Lobby. Everything would mostly play out the same way, the only difference being that Frankie's family would save the Straw Hats at the end instead of going merry. Everyone would then safely return to the city and start celebrating their victory. Things would be peaceful for a couple of days, until Garp suddenly makes an appearance and punches Ace through a wall. And then with Luffy in his grasp, the older Straw Hats would lose it once they realize Garp is his grandfather. The surprises wouldn't end there, because they would also find out about Luffy's father. With a smile, Kureha would feel confident that she made the right choice by following this kid, as there is something really special about him and his family. The next day, Frankie would reveal Thousand Sunny to the Straw Hats, and they would be absolutely impressed by it. Now, we all know that during this arc, Luffy officially asked Frankie to join the crew. But do you remember another person he asked? That's right, Iceberg. So in this version of the story, both brothers would be joining the crew. Iceberg would immediately offer to become the crew's shipwright, which would anger Frankie because that's the position he wanted for himself. Then they'd start arguing, which would make the Frankie family and Galila workers burst into laughter. Eventually, They would both settle on being shipwrights. With 2 shipwrights on board and finally enough space on board for each crewmate, the Thousand Sunny would be ready to blast off as soon as Garp decides to change his mind and starts chasing after them. The events of Thriller Bark would go on the same, without a hitch. Brook meets the crew and gets along with everyone instantly. He would be especially happy to see Crocus again, and the pair would burst into tears thinking of Laboon. In order to get his shadow back, the Straw Hats vow to face off against Gecko Moria and Oars. They'd squeeze out a somewhat easy victory with Ace and Sabo's help, as everyone would level up in terms of strength and power after everything they've been through together. As in the original, Kuma would make a sudden appearance out of nowhere, but this time with many new members, the crew would put up a great fight against him. Still, without Haki, I doubt they would actually be able to defeat him, so it's likely they'd get overwhelmed eventually. In this version of the story, Ace and Sabo would be the ones who'd step up in order to take all of Luffy's pain. However, Ace would knock Sabo out of the way and threaten an exhausted Zoro and Sanji to back off while he tanks everything on his own. The next morning, nothing happened. After receiving treatment from the 3 best doctors around and celebrating their win, the crew would set sail again, only to find 2 more members hiding on board. Those 2 would be McDonald and Unigaro, or in simpler words, the zombie tree and the zombie unicorn from Thriller Bark. At this point, Luffy would remember that he actually asked both of them to join his crew while he was on the island. So yeah, I guess these 2 weirdos are now part of the Straw Hats as well. The next destination for the Straw Hats would be Sabaody Archipelago, where Rayleigh would be absolutely shocked to see Crocus being on a pirate crew again. The 2 would then spend some time remembering the old days while Luffy goes and flattens St. Charlos, creating an international incident. Since their ship is stacked with everything they need, it's likely that older members of the crew like Gaimon, Zeph, Kureha, and Crocus would be on the ship at the time of Kizaru and Kuma's arrival, meaning that only the youngsters would be teleported away. After the commotion dies down, Rayleigh would let the rest of the crew know exactly what just happened. The older part of the crew would then go into hiding for a bit with their ship, waiting for Luffy to make contact with them again. It's important to mention that in this version of the story, both Impel Down and the Marineford arcs would never happen, since Ace was never a part of Whitebeard's crew and was never captured by Blackbeard. However, since the crew still needs to get stronger, it's likely that the time skip would still happen. Since we already know what kind of adventures the original crew went through, let's quickly go over what the new members would do during this time. I believe that Sabo would spend his time in a similar way to Robin. He would first be forced to work at Vodka Wolf until the Revolutionary Army comes by to save him. Then he would get some hockey training at Baltigo alongside Robin for the next 2 years. Meanwhile, I believe Kuma would send Ace to Sphinx Island, which is Whitebeard's hometown. There, he would learn about Whitebeard pirates and all the good they are doing around the world. He would be intrigued by this and would try to seek Whitebeard personally in order to train with him. After eventually getting captured by the Whitebeard pirates, Ace would tell Whitebeard about his father, which would make Whitebeard accept to train the boy. So 2 years and 3 days later, Ace, Sabo, and Luffy, along with the rest of the Straw Hats, would return to Sabaody. Once there, they would all be surprised to hear that one of their doctors, Kureha, became a popular doctor in the region while they were gone, while Zeph started the island's most popular food stall. Gaimon became a well-liked bar attendant, whereas Crocus spent his time lounging about in his lawn chair. The Thousand Sunny would look as good as new since the older members of the crew took good care of it. Now that their ship is coated and everyone accounted for, the Straw Hats are ready to sail underwater to get to Fishman Island. The Thousand Sunny, now reinforced by both Iceberg and Frankie, would handle this journey better than ever. The crew's stop at the Sea Forest would still happen, where they'd encounter Jimbei early. With Jimbei vouching for the crew, King Neptune would warmly welcome the Straw Hats to Ryugu Palace. Eventually, at some point, Hody Jones would launch his attack on King Neptune. However, let's be real, he stands no chance against these new Straw Hats. So after a brief fight, all of Hody's officers would be defeated while Luffy lands the final blow on Hody, completely foiling his plot. With peace restored, Neptune would offer another banquet in the crew's honor. After seeing how the crew worked together to help the fishmen without any prejudice, Jimbei would decide to form an alliance between the Fishman pirates and the Straw Hats in order to thank them for their help. Remember, Jimbei is not a part of Big Mom's crew in this version of the story, since Fishman Island would still be protected by Whitebeard, so Jimbei would be free to align with any crew he wishes. Anyway, climbing out of the sea and into the new world, the crew would soon arrive on Punk Hazard, where they would recruit 2 more members. You see, in this alternate timeline, Punk Hazard would be be completely intact, untouched by the Admiral's duel, since Marineford never happened and Sengoku never retired. Now, you may remember that during this arc, Luffy defeated the dragon. After that, he discovered a pair of severed legs fused to its back, belonging to a dismembered samurai. And what's the first thing Luffy did? That's right, he asked Kinamon's legs to join his crew. So I guess we have a new member? Or half of a member? Anyway, only a few episodes after that, Luffy invited yet another person to join his crew, Kyotaros. In case you forgot, Kyotaros is this centaur guy who Luffy thought was really cool and just had to have him on the crew. So, with 1.5 new members, the rest of this arc would play mostly the same, with Luffy absolutely destroying Caesar and heading towards Dressrosa. Once there, the Straw Hats would talk with some locals and learn a bit about the island's history. Meanwhile, Robin and Saba would reconnect with their friends from the Revolutionary Army and learn everything about Doflamingo and the suffering he has caused. As usual, while on the island, most of the crew would get into their own separate adventures, like battling living toys, Colosseum tournament, and even meeting dwarves. During the lead up to the war with Doflamingo, Luffy would eventually befriend a massive bull named Usi. In classic Luffy fashion, he would invite Usi to join the crew, same as he did in the original, which the bull would gladly accept. By this time in the original story, Thousand Sunny was attacked by Giola, who gave the crew a really tough time. However, this time around, with many different characters guarding the ship, like Zeph, Kyoreha, Crocus, and MacDonald, she would be dealt with in no time. Another interesting thing about this arc is that the entire crew would stay on Dressrosa instead of half of it going to Zoo. This would likely happen because, due to all the new and strong members, the Straw Hats would handle Don Quixote pirates much easier and wouldn't feel like they need to escape. Eventually, the arc would come to a close as Luffy unveils his Gear 4 form. At the same time, Ace, Law, Usi, and Luffy would unleash their powerful attacks and completely overpower Doflamingo before he could even activate his birdcage. Afterward, at Kinamon's request, the Straw Hats would head for Zou next in order to get the support of the Mink tribe. There, they'd arrive just in time to fend off Jack's attack, and Momonosuke would command Zunesha to destroy Jack's ship a lot sooner. Peckhams and Tomago would show up sooner or later in order to give Sanji Big Mom's letter. However, this time, their threats to kill Zeph wouldn't work, because Zeph is right there with the rest of the crew. So I believe that Sanji would just disregard this invitation, as he wants nothing to do with his family. Luffy would be fully on board with this, saying to Peckhams that if Big Mom wants Sanji, she would have to go through him first. Anyways, with Momonosuke's help, forming an alliance with the Minks would be easy, and everyone would soon depart for Wano. Oh, also, I believe that Zou is where they'd part ways with Gaimon, who would insist that this place is what he considers paradise. Instead of being alienated by people for his looks, he has finally found a place that makes him feel like he belongs. Leaving their friend behind, the crew would reach Wano within a few days. Their arrival on Wano would be met with the same troubles they faced in the main story. They'd struggle to blend in and would slowly learn just how troubled the local population is thanks to Kaido's regime. After befriending some of the locals, the Alliance would build up the troops needed to invade Onigashima during the Fire Festival. However, considering Luffy's nature, he would want to challenge Kaido well before the raid even begins in order to honor the Wano people. Seeing that Luffy isn't thinking straight, Ace and Saba would try to stop him, but it would all be in vain, so they would have no choice but to help him out. So in this version, Luffy, Sabo, and Ace would all attack Kaido together. But can they actually defeat him this early on? No, of course not. Even with all of them fighting together, they still don't know Advanced Conqueror's Haki at this point, and without it, this battle is futile. So all three brothers would wind up in prison. There, they would learn advanced forms of Haki from Hyugoro and eventually escape. Once the raid starts, the Fishman pirates led by Jinbei would also appear to support Luffy and his allies, and would completely destroy Kaido's naval forces. From here, the story would go similarly to the original, with the Straw Hats trying to reach the roof and fighting some of the Tobiropo along the way. Now, before I explain the fight against Kaido himself, there's one important thing we need to discuss. Would Big Mom even be there? You see, considering Sanji rejected the invitation this time around, it's likely that Judge would have to give Big Mom one of his other sons, like Niji or Yonji. Big Mom didn't care about Sanji specifically, so she would be more than happy to accept someone else. So instead of chasing to Wano after Luffy, this time she would just stay on her island after the wedding. And in case you were wondering, yeah, but this also means Sanji's entire family would be killed by her. Anyways, back on the rooftop, the battle against Kaido would still be somewhat tough. However, considering that this time around he would have to fight against Luffy, Ace, Sabo, Kid, and Law all by himself, his chances of winning are 0. Heck, Luffy might not even need to awaken Gear 5 at all, since Kaido would be absolutely overwhelmed way before it comes to that. In the next few days, the people of Wano would celebrate the Straw Hats for helping them, and Momo would be crowned the new shogun. Finally, before continuing their adventure, Yamato would accept Luffy's offer to join the Straw Hats in order to help the new Pirate King find the One Piece just like Odin did. So, to answer the question from the beginning, would these Straw Hats be stronger than the original ones? Of course they would! I mean, just look at this lineup of fighters. None of the other crews would dare to face them. But did you ever wonder what would the absolute strongest crew in the One Piece look like? Click on this video to find out. Like, seriously, click it. The video is pretty insane.